So one of the components of the Joint Oil Sands Monitoring Program is to assess the deposition of trace elements, including metals that might be toxic at low concentrations, to the landscape. And this has been done using both real-time monitoring of air, but also using so-called environmental archives. So this is things like snowpack depth and the concentration of contaminants in snow collected at the end of the winter. It's using things like sediment cores recovered from lakes in the region. And so I'm going to speak mainly to those two types of environmental archives, but I'm also going to talk a little bit about some of the work that's been done using lichen by WBIA to do the same sort of effort, and also work led by Bill Shoddock at the University of Alberta. And I want to thank those folks for sharing their data with me. And I'll just point out that this work has really been led by Jane Kirk and Derek Muir and Marlene Evans at Environment Canada, who very kindly brought me on board with this about a year ago. There we go. So this is a bit of a controversial topic of late. I've got two papers up here that were published in the scientific literature. The first is from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2010. This is a paper published by Aaron Kelly, David Schindler, and others, in which they reported the concentration of various toxic trace metals, or trace metals that are toxic low concentrations, in the landscape, in the river, and in the snow in the oil sands region. And then of late, we've seen this paper by Bill Shoddock that reports samples from 21 ombrotrophic bogs in the Athabasca region that reports no significant atmospheric contamination of heavy metals. So that you've got these two contrasting papers here, and I'm going to show you the data from all of this, and I would suggest that they're actually not that contradictory. So a few words first about spatial archives. So we've got all this stuff growing on the landscape, be that moss, which is illustrated here in the top left corner, or the snow that accumulates over the winter time. And what's shown here is Jane and Richard Frank sampling the snow from the oil sands region, or lichen that's growing on the tree here. So all of these things grow on the landscape, or they accumulate on the landscape, and as they do that, they incorporate trace elements that are deposited there from a variety of sources. One of the components of the Joint Oil Sands Monitoring Program has been to not only use these kinds of archives, but also to use lakes. And so what we can do is go to lakes that are situated on the landscape around the areas that are being developed and recover sediment cores. And so for 365 days a year, 24 hours a day, lakes accumulate sediment. They accumulate mud in the bottom of the lake. And as they do that, they integrate information about the lake, about its surrounding watershed, and about anything that happens to land on that lake or that watershed. And so this can be biological information like fish, like benthos that Bruce spoke about, but also about any trace elements that might land on the lake or the watershed and end up washed in there. And so for the last few years now, there's been a number of efforts to recover sediment cores from northeastern Alberta from a variety of lakes, spanning a range of environmental gradients. And I've shown the locations of some of those sediment cores on this map here. This is a geologic map. It doesn't really matter what the details are about the colors. The point is just to show you that we've got a bunch of lakes from a range of environments in the region. And for a number of these lakes, we have over 10 years of lake water monitoring data, including the concentration of trace elements in that water. And that's been collected under the RAMP program. So there's a nice opportunity to integrate both monitoring of the lake water and then the historical archive that's preserved in those sediments from those lake cores. And I don't have time to walk you through 49 elements from now 30 lake sediment cores. I don't think anybody wants me to do that. So what I'm going to do is talk about a few key elements and how those relate to development, and for a few key lake cores in the region. And I've labeled those here, and they're simply labeled with the distance. Well, most of them are labeled with the distance from sort of the center of mining activity, what's commonly referred to as AR6. It was designated AR6 in Aaron Kelly's paper. So that's what the NE20, that means Northeast 20, Northeast 13, that kind of thing. And then I just want to point out one of these is a little bit further than 60, so that's L60, that's the Ramp Lake name. It's in a bit of a different location up here. It's up on the Birch Mountains, and so it's sitting on a little bit of different bedrock. It's a little bit further away. It's over 100 kilometers away. And it's a small lake like the others, but it's the Birch Mountains are kind of a unique place. They have the metal-rich shales that occur in the Birch Mountains, and they have very high metal concentrations within the lake water. We know that from the monitoring database, and that's not necessarily a deposition thing, it's just a reflection of those metal-rich shales that the lakes sit on. The other lake that I want to mention briefly is down on the south, and I didn't circle it here, but it's one of those 2 dots to the south of Fort McMurray, and that's Gregor Lake. And it's a very large lake. It has a road in the watershed. You can contrast that with most of our other study sites. These are photos of them from the air taken in the summertime. And you can see they're very small lakes. They tend to be very simple bathymetries, sort of U-shaped on the bottom. And they have minimal disturbance in their watershed. And that's important because what we're really trying to get at is an atmospheric signal. And so we don't want cars and trucks driving by the lake confounding that signal. And so what we do is we go back, we survey them in the summer, and then we go back in the wintertime when there's a nice layer of lake ice to land the helicopter on, and we recover 3 or so sediment cores from each of those lakes using a lake sediment core. So once we have those sediment cores, we can bring them back to the hangar in Fort McMurray. We can chop them up vertically into 1/2 centimeter slices, and each one of those slices represents a unit of time, a unit of deposition on the lake bottom. And so what we can then do is take those slices, send them to the lab. We can date them using different radioisotopes that decay at a known rate. We can measure the concentration of, in this case, 46 elements, but we're also doing PAHs, mercury. We're looking at primary production back through time using chlorophyll A at Queen's University, percent carbon, percent nitrogen, and different isotopes of productivity, looking at diatoms, so looking at the critters that grow in those lakes, and then most recently looking at black carbon. So this is a large effort involving a number of researchers with universities across Canada. So what I'm showing you here is I've got depth on, so this is the depth in each one of those sediment cores on the y-axis, and then age on the x-axis. And you get older in time as you move from right to left. And so that each one of those lines is from one of those sediment cores, and it relates depth to time. So this is the result of those dating techniques that we can use, and this gives us a tool to go back on one of those cores and say, okay, how old is the sediment from 15 centimeters depth on sediment core X or whatever. So we've got roughly decadal scale resolution, and so what that means is that each one of those 1/2 centimeters intervals that we chopped off of those cores represents about 10 years of deposition. And this varies among the lakes. You can see lakes with a steeper age-depth relationship. They're going to have a higher rate of mud accumulation, and so you have a much higher resolution record, but you have a shorter record as well. So I'm going to show you the concentration in the sediments from 2 elements. Aluminum, which is a good proxy for sort of dust that's carried around across the landscape for erosion in the watershed of these lakes, and for as a proxy of sort of natural erosion as well. And what you'll notice is that those 2 sites that I mentioned earlier, L60, which is in the Birch Mountains, and Gregor, have much, much higher concentrations of aluminum than any of the other lakes. But what you'll also notice, hopefully, and apologies for the scale here, but what you'll also notice is that there isn't much of an increase in any of the lakes. You don't see a huge increase in aluminum. Despite all of the activity that's going on in the region of the dust that's being deposited, you don't see large increases. And I actually have a slide afterwards, if people are interested, where I've taken those two high ones out, and you can see that that's indeed the case. Now, if you contrast this with vanadium, we do see an increase in a number of the lakes that are located close to the center of mining activities, but we don't see that increase in the lakes that are located further away. And I've chosen vanadium here because it's kind of an interesting element when it comes to oil sands. It's one of the very few that it happens to be enriched in bitumen. Bitumen's not enriched in, say, things like lead or mercury, but it is enriched in vanadium. And it can be toxic at higher concentrations. Now, none of these concentrations exceed guidelines, but it is of interest that we do see detect a change from an increase from oil sands mining. And one of the real powers about lake sediments cores is that they allow us to go back in time to a point where we didn't have monitoring data to monitor these various parameters back through time. So, like I said, I don't want to walk you through 46 elements on 30 cores, but one of the things we can do to try and summarize these sort of very large multivariate complex data sets is to put them into what's called a principal components analysis. And so this essentially looks for relationships among all of these different variables and tries to extract sort of 1 or 2 key almost synthetic variables or gradients within those data sets. And Kevin spoke a bit about this with the WBIA work that's been done before. What we see is that we can account for about 86% of the variability within that data set with just 4 of those synthetic gradients or synthetic variables. And what we see is some clear clustering of base cations and really strong positive loading on that first axis, that's that x-axis, for most of the metals that we've measured. Now, if we overlay the lakes onto this space, what we see is that we get that clear separation. So we've got, the Gregor and L60 are not only high in aluminum and vanadium, but they're high in almost every single one of those elements that we measured. They're higher than almost all the other lakes. But what's really interesting is that we see this separation of all the rest of the lakes sort of up to down along that second axis. And so we have this clear separation between near field and far field sites. And if you look at those sites that plot on the left, those all separate out according to the distance from AR6, from that center of mining. And so we're seeing a very strong spatial gradient within the sediment cores that we can detect using these multivariate techniques. So now just a stab at trying to integrate this work with some of the other work that's been done by WBIA and by the U of A, by Bill Shattuck and his group. If we plot the concentration of vanadium, and I've mentioned before why we want to use vanadium, if we plot the concentration of vanadium as a function of the distance from AR6, what we see is this very clear exponential decrease in concentration or in loading in the case of snow as you move away from the mines. And it's actually really quite remarkable how well all 3 of these media agree, whether it's moss, whether it's the lichen from WBIA, or whether it's the snow from Josum's work, but even previously with Aaron Kelly's. You see this same exponential decrease expressed in all of these archives, despite the fact that they are integrating different seasons, right? The snow is capturing only the winter months, and the lichen, or the moss especially, really isn't seeing any of the winter at all. If we do the same thing with the lake sediments, and now I've stripped off the moss and the lichen, and what I've plotted instead is the snow and the ratio of the concentration in the most recent 10 years relative to the concentration prior to 1960, so prior to any development occurring. When you look at that ratio, you see that same relative increase as you move closer to the mine. So you see a greater ratio as you move closer to the center of mining activity. And so that's really nice to see, because it tells us not only is everything sort of behaving the same and recording the same signal, but it tells us that now we have a tool that we can go back through time and understand how these sort of emissions have changed through time. So just a few conclusions here to wrap up. We have different seasonal archives from different groups that reveal a consistent pattern of trace metal deposition across the landscape. We've got clear differences in the timing and the magnitude of metal enrichment preserved within those sediment cores that we're currently working on. And then one thing I just want to mention that I didn't really mention during the talk is that the loading of the PCA species, whether you include the far field sites or not, we've run it a bunch of different ways, match quantitatively really well with the PCA work and the source characterization work that WBIA did with the Environmental Protection Agency in the United States. And so what we've been doing recently is working with Matt Landis at the EPA, working with Kevin Percy, and really trying to bring their data into the Josum data and trying to get everything sort of talking the same language, analyze all of the data together, and really try and get at this source characterization piece using not only the lichen, but the snow and the lake sediment. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions.